Jack Peterson stood alone, looking down at the pocket watch in his hand as though it might somehow answer him. The watch gleamed faintly, its silver surface aged, but still polished from years of careful handling. It had been his father's watch, a man he'd looked up to with equal parts admiration and affection. The fine engravings around the edges were worn in places, faded by time and use, but it was the only thing Jack had left of his father, the last piece of a man he could barely remember anymore. This watch had seen so much, had been present for so many family moments. Jack could practically feel its memories pulsing through his fingertips as he held it. His father had once said that time was something to be treasured but never controlled, and Jack had taken those words to heart. The irony now of having to sell time itself wasn't lost on him, and it filled him with an ache he couldn't express, even to himself. But Lily's illness had taken everything, drained every possible reserve his family had, and now there was nothing left, nothing except for this watch. He knew that Lily's condition was worsening, the hospital bills mounting as his mother, Karen, tried to stay strong, keeping a constant vigil by her daughter's bedside. Every day, she held Lily's hand, urging her to hold on just a little longer. Jack wanted to believe that his sister, with her small frame and quiet voice, was strong enough to keep fighting. But the truth weighed on him. She needed more than just his hopes. She needed real medical intervention, and quickly. This watch could buy her that chance. It had to. With a determined breath, Jack steeled himself. He turned and made his way down the street, heading toward Harold Jenkins' pawn shop, an old establishment with a reputation for fair, if frugal offers. He had never set foot inside before, but desperation drove him now. His steps were measured, steady, though his heart felt like it might beat out of his chest. He knew what he had to do, but each step toward that shop felt like he was walking away from a part of himself he might never reclaim. The small bell above the door gave a muted ring as he stepped inside, and Jack was greeted by the dim light filtering through dusty windows. The shop's interior was cluttered, filled with relics and items left behind by others who, like him, had traded pieces of their lives to meet desperate needs. Harold Jenkins, the shop's grizzled owner, sat behind the counter, squinting down at a thick ledger, his glasses balanced on the edge of his nose. He looked up when Jack entered, his eyes sharp and assessing as they landed on him. "What can I do for you?" Harold asked, his voice gravelly from years of barking prices and making deals. His gaze flickered to the watch in Jack's hand, his expression shifting slightly as he registered the age and quality of the item. Jack walked up to the counter, holding the watch out with a hand that trembled just slightly. Harold's eyes lingered on the watch for a moment before he reached out, taking it delicately between his rough fingers. He lifted his magnifying glass, examining it with a practiced eye, his expression unreadable. Jack could only watch in silence as Harold turned the watch over, scrutinizing every detail with a care that bordered on reverence. Finally, Harold looked up, his gaze meeting Jack's. "It's a fine piece," he said, almost reluctantly. "An heirloom, I'd guess." Jack nodded, feeling his throat tighten. "It was my father's," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He swallowed, forcing himself to stay composed. "But I need to sell it. My sister, she's very sick. This is the only way to pay for her treatment." Harold's gaze softened for a moment, though his expression quickly returned to one of businesslike detachment. "I see," he murmured. He glanced down at the watch again, weighing it in his hand as if trying to calculate its value not just in dollars, but in memories, in meaning. Jack felt himself holding his breath. After a moment, Harold lowered the magnifying glass, setting it aside with a quiet clink. "I can offer you $1,000, he said, his tone final, leaving no room for negotiation. Jack felt his stomach drop. He'd hoped for more, needed more. He'd researched the value, knew it was worth at least twice that, but he didn't have the leverage to bargain. This was the only place he could turn, the only hope left. Still, he couldn't help but try, his voice filled with a quiet desperation. "Are you sure that's all you can offer?" he asked, his voice barely steady. I need more than that." Harold's gaze didn't waver. "Look, kid," he said, almost gently. "I know what it's worth, but I also know what I can sell it for. And in this market, 1,000 is as good as you're going to get. I don't make these offers lightly." Jack felt his grip on hope slipping. He looked down, clenching his jaw, trying to keep the disappointment from showing too much. He knew Harold wasn't going to budge. He could see it in the man's resolute stare. Jack let out a slow breath, nodding, though it felt like a piece of his heart was breaking with emotion. "All right," he said finally, his voice small, barely more than a whisper. He reached out, taking the bills Harold handed him, feeling the crispness of the money in his hand, the weight of it all too real, yet somehow not enough. He tucked the cash into his pocket, but the emptiness left behind by the watch felt like a wound. As he turned to leave, Harold called out after him, "For what it's worth, kid. I hope your sister pulls through." His voice had a hint of warmth, almost remorse, that caught Jack by surprise. But Jack only managed a nod, his gratitude too tangled up in the bitter reality of what he'd just lost to form a proper response. The walk home felt longer than usual, his steps heavy. Jack tried to focus on the money in his pocket, on the fact that it would help Lily, that it would give her a fighting chance. But as he reached his home, he felt the weight of what he'd sacrificed pressing down on him. That watch had been his last link to his father, the one thing he had that reminded him of who he was, of who his family had been before everything fell apart. As he climbed the steps to the porch, he saw a familiar figure waiting for him. Emily Brooks, his friend since childhood, stood by the front door, her gaze soft and filled with concern as she looked at him. Did you get the money?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jack managed a small nod, though his expression betrayed the depth of his disappointment. "Not enough," he said, his voice thick with defeat. "It's not enough, Emily. I thought it would be more." Emily's face softened with empathy. She reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "Jack," she murmured, her voice warm and steady, "we'll figure something out. I'm with you. You don't have to do this alone." Jack looked at her, seeing the unshakable resolve in her eyes. He tried to muster a smile, though his heart felt heavy. "Thanks, Emily," he said, his voice barely steady. I just don't know what else to do. I feel like I'm running out of options." She gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze, her gaze unwavering. "We'll find a way, Jack. Together." In that quiet moment on the porch, with Emily's hand on his shoulder and the weight of everything he'd lost settling over him, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he wasn't alone in facing it. As the night deepened, he found himself lost in thought, wondering if there was some unknown path still open to him, some unexpected way to save his sister and keep his family whole. The thought lingered, a small flicker of possibility, even as he walked inside and braced himself for what was to come. In the morning, a letter would arrive, an invitation that would change everything, pulling him into a world of secrets, family, and revelations beyond anything he could imagine. The next morning, Jack's routine was interrupted by a distinct knock at the door. When he opened it, he found a small, elegant envelope lying on the doorstep, his name carefully written on the front in cursive. The paper was thick, expensive, its weight unusual for anything he usually received. Puzzled, Jack picked it up, turning it over to find a seal stamped with a crest he didn't recognize. Slowly, he broke the seal and unfolded the card inside. The message was brief yet formal, an invitation to meet with Thomas Bennett, the CEO of Bennett Industries. Bennett Industries was a name he'd only heard whispered in stories of wealth and power, people who lived in another world entirely from his own. Jack frowned, reading the message over and over, wondering what on earth could warrant a personal invitation from someone so high up. The very idea of it seemed surreal. Still dazed, Jack walked back into the kitchen, where his mother Karen was seated, deep in thought over a cup of coffee. She looked up as he entered, noting the expression of confusion and hesitation on his face. "Mom, look at this," he said, handing her the invitation. She took it, her eyes narrowing as she examined the card. "Thomas Bennett? Of Bennett Industries," she read aloud, astonishment in her voice. "Jack, why would someone like him want to meet with you?" Jack shook his head, still baffled. "I have no idea. I've never met him. I mean, why would a billionaire even know who I am?" He paused, feeling the tension of a new strange hope forming in the pit of his stomach. Could this be? Could he have somehow heard about Lily? Karen looked down at the card, deep in thought. It might be Jack. It could be someone reached out, maybe from the hospital or, I don't know, maybe someone's trying to help. Either way, this could be an opportunity. She handed the card back to him, her eyes filled with cautious optimism. Jack took a deep breath. The idea of walking into some corporate giant's office was intimidating, to say the least, but if it meant a chance to help Lily. "Yeah. I think I have to go," he said, trying to steady his voice. Maybe this could actually be something good." Karen gave him a reassuring nod. "Just be yourself, Jack. Go and see what he has to say. Maybe this is what we've been waiting for. Strich. That afternoon, Jack arrived at Bennett Industries, a massive building that towered over him as he looked up from the sidewalk, feeling small and uncertain. The glass exterior gleamed, revealing an entrance lined with marble floors and a lobby that looked more like the hall of a museum than a place of business. Taking a steadying breath, Jack walked through the revolving doors, his heart racing. Inside, he was greeted by a young receptionist who checked his name and then gestured toward a hallway. "Alice Turner, Mr. Bennett's assistant, will take you from here," she said, giving him a polite smile. A moment later, a woman in a tailored suit appeared. Alice Turner's professional demeanor was softened by the warmth in her eyes as she extended her hand. "Jack Peterson? I'm Alice. Mr. Bennett has been expecting you. Right this way." Jack followed her down a quiet corridor, each step echoing his nervousness. They arrived at a set of grand double doors, which Alice opened with a practiced ease, ushering him inside a spacious, elegantly decorated office. The walls were lined with tasteful art and tall shelves filled with leather-bound books. At the far end of the room stood Thomas Bennett himself, a man in his early 60s with silver-streaked hair and a steady gaze that held both authority and kindness. Thomas crossed the room to greet Jack, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Jack, thank you for coming." Jack took the hand, surprised by the genuine friendliness in the man's voice. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Bennett," he replied, the words feeling inadequate for the situation. Thomas motioned for him to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. Jack sank into it, trying to ignore how out of place he felt in this world of wealth and power. As he sat, Thomas leaned forward, studying him with a look of quiet intensity. "I'll get straight to the point," Thomas began, his tone calm but serious. "I'm aware of the watch you sold recently." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It belonged to my father." Jack's brows shot up in confusion. "Your father?" he echoed, disbelief creeping into his voice. "But it was my father's watch." Thomas nodded, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "Yes. And that's where things get complicated, Jack," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were measuring each word. "You see, your father was my half-brother." For a long moment, Jack sat in stunned silence, trying to process the words. What are you saying?" he managed finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "How could I not know that we're family?" Thomas's face softened, an expression of empathy and regret crossing his features. "It's not your fault, Jack. There were reasons. Long-standing family issues that kept us apart. For years, I tried to trace you, to find my brother's family, but it was like searching for a ghost. I thought I'd lost you all until, by pure chance, I came across that watch. When I saw it, I knew." Jack swallowed hard, his emotions tangled in a knot of disbelief, anger, and a sliver of reluctant hope. "So you've known about us? For how long?" Thomas let out a breath, his gaze turning inward, as if remembering years of attempts and missed connections. "I've known you existed, Jack. But knowing and finding are two very different things. I wanted to be sure it was really you before reaching out. I didn't want to bring up painful memories or give false hope if I was wrong." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. Jack shifted in his seat, wrestling with 1,000 thoughts. Here he was, facing a man he never knew existed, a man who claimed to be family, someone who held the potential to change everything. But could he trust it? Could he believe in this connection after so much had already been lost? "Why now?" Jack finally asked, his voice thick with barely contained skepticism. "Why reach out now, after all these years?" Thomas looked at him, his gaze unwavering. "Because it's time, Jack. Because I believe in family, even if life has kept us apart until now. And because, from what I understand, you and your family could use a helping hand. I'd like to offer you that, if you're willing." Jack could feel his heart pounding, a mixture of relief, apprehension, and something that felt like vulnerability. He didn't want charity, but the reality of Lily's condition pressed down on him, reminding him that this might be the miracle they so desperately needed. He took a deep breath, weighing his words. "Mr. Bennett, I don't know what to say. This is a lot to take in," Jack confessed. "And my sister, she's very sick. I sold that watch to try and pay for her treatment, but it wasn't enough. I'm not looking for a handout, but if there's any way I could," his voice trailed off, emotions crowding his throat. Thomas leaned forward, his expression filled with a quiet resolve. "Jack, let me help. Let me do what your father would have done for my family if the roles were reversed. I can arrange for your sister's treatment, and I can help in other ways too. I want to make up for the time we've lost. Let's start there." The words hung in the air, and Jack felt a sudden overwhelming wave of emotion. This man, this stranger who was somehow his family, was offering a way out, a way to save Lily and maybe, just maybe, find a place where he and his family belonged. After a long moment, Jack nodded, a flicker of trust beginning to take root amidst the doubt and questions that still lingered. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. I don't know what to say, other than thank you." Thomas smiled, his expression filled with a mix of relief and pride. "Please, call me Thomas. And let's take this one step at a time. I'll make the arrangements for Lily immediately." As Jack stood to leave, he glanced back at Thomas, the reality of the situation still sinking in. He had come here a stranger, but he was leaving with the possibility of a new beginning, of finding family he never knew existed. And as he walked through the elegant corridors back to the lobby, the thought stayed with him, filling him with a cautious but undeniable sense of hope. Jack could barely comprehend what had just happened. The truth Thomas had shared about his father, the connection between them, and the unexpected offer to help with Lily's treatment, it was overwhelming, surreal. When he got home, his mother, Karen, was waiting for him. She sat at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her posture tense as she looked up at him. Jack could see the worry etched into her expression. She had been waiting, expecting news, but nothing like the story he was about to share. Jack took a seat across from her, rubbing a hand across his face, still searching for the words to explain. He met her eyes, trying to gauge where to begin. "Mom," he started, his voice shaky, "I don't know how to say this without it sounding impossible." Karen's brow furrowed with concern. "Jack, what's going on? You're scaring me." Jack took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I met Thomas Bennett, the CEO of Bennett Industries." He paused, waiting for her reaction, but she only nodded, listening closely, her confusion growing. He told me that he's family, Mom. He said that he and Dad were half-brothers." For a long moment, Karen simply stared at him, her face shifting between confusion, disbelief, and something else, a recognition perhaps of a truth buried somewhere deep within her memory. She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "Jack, are you saying that man is your uncle?" Jack nodded slowly, watching her as she struggled to process what he had just revealed. "That's what he told me, Mom. He said he's been trying to find us ever since Dad passed away, but he didn't know where to look. It was only because I sold the watch, Dad's watch, that he even realized we existed." Karen's eyes misted as she absorbed the information, and for a moment, she seemed lost in thought, looking somewhere beyond the room, perhaps searching her memory for some indication of the hidden family ties that Thomas had mentioned. "I can't believe it," she murmured finally. Her voice was low, as though speaking louder might shatter the fragile possibility that all of this could be real. "Your father, he never talked about his past, about his family. I knew there was something he kept close, but I never pressed him. He would change the subject, say it didn't matter anymore. I thought it was just too painful for him to remember, but I never imagined." Jack leaned forward, resting a hand on her arm. "I know, Mom. I don't think he wanted us to know for some reason. But Thomas seemed genuine, and he told me he wants to help us. He said he's already arranged for Lily to have surgery, with one of the best doctors in the country." Karen's expression softened, a mixture of hope and skepticism filling her eyes. "Jack, that's incredible. But why now? Why, after all this time, would he reach out now?" Jack shrugged, feeling the weight of her question. "I don't know, Mom. But I think he really does want to help. He said he regrets not being able to find us sooner, that he wants to make up for lost time. And he promised me he'd take care of everything. I believe him." Karen sat back, letting out a shaky breath. She was silent for a long time, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her coffee mug. She looked at Jack, her eyes filling with a cautious optimism. "If he's offering, Jack, if he's sincere, maybe this is what we've been waiting for." The very next morning, everything was set in motion. True to his word, Thomas had organized for Lily's immediate transfer to a private hospital renowned for its specialized care. A sleek black car arrived to pick up Jack, Karen, and Lily, a sight that drew curious glances from neighbors who had never seen anything so grand parked in their modest street. As they climbed into the car, Jack couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and disbelief, as though they were stepping into another world entirely. When they arrived, the hospital staff welcomed them with warmth and professionalism. The halls were quiet, the rooms immaculate, and the staff attentive to every detail. Jack could feel Karen's unease as she looked around, unused to this level of luxury, but they both knew that this was the best chance they had for Lily. Soon after they arrived, they were approached by a tall, dignified man in a white coat, his silver hair neatly combed back and a look of calm assurance on his face. He extended a hand to Jack and Karen, introducing himself as Dr. Samuel Richards. "Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Peterson," he greeted them with a gentle smile and a steady, reassuring gaze. "I'm Dr. Richards. I'll be handling Lily's care and overseeing her surgery." Jack shook his hand, feeling the doctor's firm, confident grip, and his tension began to ease. "Thank you, Dr. Richards. We're so grateful for this opportunity. We couldn't have done this without Mr. Bennett's help." Dr. Richards nodded, his expression understanding. "Thomas Bennett has been very generous in ensuring your sister has the best care possible. And you should know, Lily's case is important to all of us here. I've reviewed her medical records carefully, and I believe we have a strong plan in place to give her the best possible outcome." Jack glanced over at Lily, who sat quietly, wrapped in a blanket, her small hands clutching a stuffed animal. She was brave, but he could see the apprehension in her eyes, the fear hidden behind her brave smile. Dr. Richards walked over to her, crouching to meet her gaze. "Hi, Lily," he said softly. "I know this is a little scary, but I want you to know that we're going to take very good care of you. You'll have a team of people here who are all rooting for you." Lily nodded, her smile trembling slightly, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. She looked at Jack, and he gave her a reassuring nod, trying to hide his own nerves. A nurse approached then, a young woman with a warm smile and a calm demeanor. "Hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Lee, and I'll be Lily's primary nurse during her stay with us. We're going to make sure she's comfortable, and we'll take everything step by step so that it's not overwhelming. You'll have my full attention anytime you need it, Lily." Karen's face softened as she took Jessica's hand, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Jessica. It means so much to us. We've been through so much, and knowing she's in such good hands is more than I could have hoped for." Jessica's smile was kind, and she gave Karen's hand a gentle squeeze. "We're here to help make this as easy as possible for your family, Mrs. Peterson. If there's ever anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." Dr. Richards placed a steady hand on Jack's shoulder, drawing his attention back. "Your sister is very lucky to have you, Jack. I can see how much you care for her, and that kind of support makes a difference. She's strong, and from what I can tell, she's inherited that strength from her family." He paused, looking Jack in the eyes. "We're going to do everything we can to help her heal. You have my word." Jack nodded, struggling to find the words to express his gratitude. His heart was filled with hope he hadn't felt in so long, and he knew that whatever happened, they would be giving Lily the best chance they could. "Thank you, Dr. Richards. Really, thank you. We've waited a long time for this chance." With a final nod, Dr. Richards smiled and turned to Jessica, who began to guide them through the preparations for Lily's treatment. As Lily's recovery progressed, Jack found himself spending more time with Thomas. He tried to understand the man who, despite their sudden connection, was still essentially a stranger. They shared meals, spent quiet moments talking in Thomas's study, and occasionally even discussed business, conversations that fascinated Jack, opening him to a world far removed from his own. Slowly, Jack began to see glimpses of the uncle he'd never known, someone generous and deeply committed to family. But it was clear that, in Thomas's world, family meant something both powerful and fraught, carrying its own set of expectations. One day, during one of these visits, Thomas invited Jack to meet his son, Michael. Jack's anticipation mixed with nerves, wondering what it would be like to connect with a cousin he'd never known. When Michael arrived, he was polished, with a confident stride and the easy manner of someone raised to expect respect and admiration. He extended his hand to Jack with a measured smile that seemed to come more from obligation than genuine warmth. "So," Michael said, his tone friendly but guarded as they shook hands, "you're my long-lost cousin." He let out a small chuckle, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Jack nodded, feeling a touch of discomfort at Michael's intense, scrutinizing gaze. "Looks like it," he replied, hoping to find common ground. "I never imagined all of this. It's been a lot to take in." Michael tilted his head, nodding as though to agree, but there was something calculating in his expression. "I bet," he said smoothly, crossing his arms. "Must be quite a change." The way he said it held an edge, as though Jack's arrival was more a disruption than a reunion. Jack could sense an invisible wall between them, one that Michael had no intention of lowering. Jack forced a smile, hoping to soften the atmosphere. "Yeah, it's overwhelming at times. But I'm grateful. For the help with Lily, I mean. I wouldn't have been able to do it alone." Michael's gaze flickered slightly at the mention of Lily, but he quickly masked it. "My father's a generous man," he said, a touch of pride in his voice. "Family means a lot to him. But just so we're clear," he hesitated, leaning in a fraction, "I'm protective of what's ours." The words hung in the air, and Jack felt the implicit warning. He understood. Michael saw him as an outsider, someone who had suddenly been granted access to their private world, a world he didn't entirely welcome Jack into. Jack could feel his pulse quicken as he held Michael's gaze, trying to remain calm. "I get it, Michael," he replied evenly. "I'm not here to take anything. I just want my sister to be okay." Michael's smile tightened, a flash of irritation in his eyes before he looked away. "Right. Well, that's good to know," he said, his tone laced with a subtle sarcasm. He excused himself shortly afterward, leaving Jack with an uneasy feeling, as though he'd just been given an unspoken warning to stay within invisible boundaries. That evening, Jack met up with Emily, the one person who always helped him make sense of his tangled emotions. They sat on a bench outside the hospital where Lily was recovering, and Jack recounted the tense encounter, trying to make sense of it. "Michael, it's like he's polite enough on the surface, but there's this resentment, this hostility he can't hide," Jack told her, shaking his head. "I didn't come here to disrupt his life. All I want is to give Lily the chance to get better. That's it." Emily listened carefully, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "It sounds like he sees you as a threat, Jack. It's probably the suddenness of it all, finding out he has a cousin and seeing his father reach out to help you. Maybe he thinks, I don't know, that you're trying to take his place." Jack let out a deep sigh, staring down at his hands. "But that's not what this is. I don't want his life. I'm just here for Lily. None of this was even part of the plan." Emily gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "I know that, Jack. But you're the new face here, and maybe for someone like him, that's all it takes to feel threatened." As the days passed, the tension with Michael only grew. Michael's cordial front held, but his interactions with Jack were punctuated by offhand comments and quiet looks of disdain. Jack tried to focus on Lily and his time with Thomas, ignoring the way Michael's stare seemed to linger, calculating and unreadable. One afternoon, Jack found himself in Thomas's office, going over some of the projects Bennett Industries was managing. Thomas was explaining the structure of the company and its history, the pride evident in his voice, when Michael walked in. "Dad," Michael said, his eyes flickering to Jack before settling on his father, "I didn't realize we had company." Thomas looked up, surprised but pleased. "Michael, come join us. I was just telling Jack about the company's expansion plans. I thought it might interest him." Michael's smile was forced as he nodded, coming to stand near the desk. "Of course," he said coolly, glancing at Jack. "Though it's a lot to take in for someone new to the family." Jack kept his gaze steady, refusing to let Michael's comment get under his skin. He could feel Thomas shift, picking up on the tension but choosing to move forward, perhaps hoping they would find common ground. "Jack's family now, Michael," Thomas reminded him gently, casting an encouraging look at both of them. "I thought it would be good for him to understand the business, especially if he wants to get more involved." Michael's face tensed, and Jack could see a flash of resentment in his eyes. "Of course, Dad," he replied, his voice clipped. "But just remember, I've spent my whole life preparing to take on more here." Thomas gave his son a reassuring smile. "I know, son. And your role here is as solid as ever. Jack is family, and he's welcome, but your future here isn't in question." Michael nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. His expression softened slightly, but Jack could still see the guarded hostility beneath it. When he left the office, Jack felt the silence settle over them, the tension dissipating with his exit. Thomas let out a small sigh, glancing at Jack. "Don't mind him too much," he said quietly. "Michael's always been protective of his place here. He's never known a family beyond the one we had, so this is new for him." Jack nodded, the weight of the situation pressing on him. "I understand, Thomas. I didn't mean to complicate things for him. He trailed off, feeling the helplessness rise within him. "I just want to be here for Lily." Thomas placed a comforting hand on Jack's shoulder. "And that's all I want for you. Don't let his attitude discourage you. Your family, Jack. Whether he realizes it yet or not." But Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being an intruder, of somehow upsetting a balance he hadn't meant to disturb. Michael's simmering hostility finally boiled over. His distrust of Jack, which had been growing ever since their first tense conversation, reached a breaking point. Despite Jack's attempts to focus on his work and build a positive relationship within Bennett Industries, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Jack's presence threatened his own position in the family business. Driven by resentment and a desire to undermine Jack, Michael made a reckless decision, one that would throw Jack's progress and reputation into turmoil. Under the guidance of David Clark, one of Bennett Industries' most experienced managers, Jack had been working on an important project, a crucial presentation for a new client that represented a potential multi-million-dollar partnership. Jack had invested countless hours into it, studying the intricacies of the client's needs, carefully planning the strategy, and preparing to deliver a polished presentation. David had been encouraging and supportive, providing insights and advice that helped Jack gain confidence in his abilities. On the day of the presentation, however, everything went wrong. Jack arrived early, determined to make a good impression. But as he opened the presentation file on his laptop, his heart sank. Critical data had been altered, numbers had been manipulated, and the slides were completely out of order. His well-prepared presentation was a chaotic mess, and he had no idea how this had happened. With only minutes before the meeting, Jack scrambled to fix what he could, but it was impossible to repair all the damage in time. The meeting with the clients went terribly. They left unimpressed and wary, and the potential deal fell through. By the time the dust settled, Jack knew his reputation was on the line. When word got back to Thomas, he called Jack into his office, his tone uncharacteristically stern. "Jack," Thomas began, his voice carrying a weight of disappointment. "I've heard the client wasn't impressed today. And the team is saying there were errors in the data, mistakes that cost us this partnership. I need to know what happened." Jack's throat was tight, his mind racing with a mixture of anger and confusion. He'd gone over that presentation dozens of times. He knew every detail, every number. Something wasn't right, and he needed Thomas to understand that. "Thomas, I don't know how it happened," Jack said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I checked everything, reviewed every part of the presentation. But when I opened it this morning, the data was all wrong. Someone must have tampered with it." Thomas looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you saying someone in this company sabotaged your work?" Jack hesitated, knowing how serious the accusation sounded. But he also knew he hadn't made those changes, and he couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was actively working against him. "I don't know who it could have been," he admitted carefully. "But I didn't make those mistakes, Thomas. I need you to believe me." Thomas was silent for a long moment, his gaze penetrating as he studied Jack's face. Finally, he nodded, though his expression was clouded with doubt. "I'll look into it," he said, his tone measured. "But in the meantime, you'll need to rebuild the trust of the team. The client wasn't happy, and they're a major loss for us." Jack nodded, swallowing his frustration. He knew that without proof, he had no choice but to accept the consequences. As he left the office, he felt the weight of failure pressing down on him, but he couldn't shake the suspicion that Michael was behind this. It was the only explanation that made sense. That evening, determined to get answers, Jack confronted Michael in one of the corridors of the company building. He approached him, his jaw set, his voice low but charged with anger. "Michael, I need to know the truth," Jack said, his eyes locked onto his cousin's face. "Did you mess with my presentation?" Michael looked at him, his expression hardening, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he simply smirked, a cold glint in his eyes. "What if I did?" he replied, his tone mocking. "What are you going to do about it?" Jack clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. "Why are you doing this, Michael? I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm just trying to help my family, help Lily." Michael's expression turned cold, his voice laced with contempt. "You don't belong here, Jack. This is my family, my company. You're just a stranger who showed up out of nowhere, trying to make a place for yourself. But I won't let you ruin everything I've worked for. So stay out of my way." Jack stared at him, a mixture of hurt and anger swirling inside him. He'd never wanted to compete with Michael, never wanted to interfere in his life. But Michael's words made it clear that he saw Jack as a threat, someone who didn't deserve to be part of the family. "I didn't ask for this, Michael," Jack said, his voice shaking with emotion. "All I wanted was to give Lily a chance. I'm not trying to take anything from you." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Just remember what I said. Stay out of my way." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Jack standing alone, his heart pounding with frustration and betrayal. He'd come here with the hope of building a relationship with his family, but now he realized that Michael would never see him as anything other than an intruder. Later that night, Jack met up with Emily. They sat in their usual spot, a quiet bench overlooking the city, where Jack could finally let his guard down. He told her everything, about the sabotaged presentation, the failed meeting, and the confrontation with Michael. Emily listened intently, her expression turning from sympathy to anger as he spoke. "Jack, this is ridiculous," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "Michael's acting like a spoiled child. He's threatened by you, and he's willing to ruin your work just to protect his own ego." Jack let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to do, Emily. It feels like everything I do just makes things worse. Maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe I should just leave, take Lily and Mom and go." Emily shook her head firmly, placing her hand on his. "No, Jack. You have every right to be here. This is your family too, and you deserve to know them, to be a part of this. Don't let Michael push you out. You've come too far to give up now." Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt but also with a flicker of hope. "I don't know, Em. It just feels like I'm tearing this family apart." Emily squeezed his hand, her voice steady and reassuring. "Michael's actions don't define this family, Jack. And you're not tearing anything apart. You're just trying to find your place, and that's okay. You deserve that chance." Jack nodded, taking in her words, letting them settle in his mind. She was right. He couldn't let Michael's hostility drive him away. He'd fought too hard to be here, to give Lily a chance, to find his own place in this family. As he sat beside Emily, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He would find a way to stay, to prove that he belonged, even if it meant facing Michael's resentment head-on. Thomas, seeing the rising tension within his family, knew that the situation could not go on unresolved. The friction between Michael and Jack was palpable, and even Elizabeth's unease had grown noticeable. So he decided to gather everyone for a meeting, a serious conversation where nothing would remain unsaid. He chose the dining room, a place where the family had traditionally come together for meals, celebrations, and moments of unity. As everyone gathered, the room was filled with a charged silence. Jack sat next to his mother, Karen, who looked around, clearly uncomfortable in the grand setting. She shifted in her seat, a hint of nervousness in her eyes as she took in the unfamiliar family faces around the table. Across from them sat Michael, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression locked in a rigid mask. Elizabeth, seated beside Michael, had her gaze fixed on Thomas, a faint line of worry furrowing her brow. The only one who seemed openly warm was Sophia, Thomas's youngest daughter, who offered Jack a kind, encouraging smile. Thomas cleared his throat, drawing all eyes toward him. He placed his hands flat on the table, his gaze steady, exuding an unmistakable air of authority mixed with something softer, a resolve to protect the family he valued so deeply. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the weight of years of leadership tempered with a personal vulnerability. "There are things we need to address as a family. Tensions have been growing ever since Jack and Karen came into our lives, and I know this hasn't been easy on anyone. But if we're to move forward together, we need honesty and understanding." He looked around the table, his gaze settling on each family member in turn. When his eyes met Jack's, there was a clear message of support, a reminder that Jack wasn't alone in this. "Jack and Karen are part of our family," Thomas continued firmly. "They carry the same blood, and they deserve to be treated with the same respect and acceptance as anyone else in this room." There was a moment of silence as everyone absorbed his words. Elizabeth, who had been quietly thoughtful, finally spoke up, her voice cautious but steady. "Thomas," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I understand that Jack and Karen are family, and I know this is important to you. But you have to see that for us, this is a lot. Everything has changed so quickly." She looked at Jack, her expression softening, though a hint of reservation remained. "We just need time to process all of this. To adapt." Jack nodded, acknowledging her point, even as he felt the sting of being seen as an outsider. "I get it, Mrs. Bennett," he said quietly. "I didn't come here expecting things to change overnight, and I didn't want to disrupt anything. I just want to do right by my sister, and maybe find my place here." Thomas gave Elizabeth an understanding look, his voice reassuring. "And you will have that time. But I need us to work through this together, not with division." Michael, who had been glaring at the table, suddenly looked up, the barely concealed resentment in his eyes sparking into something more. He glanced at Jack, then at Thomas, his voice tense. "And where do I fit into this new family picture, Dad?" His tone was tight, a sharp edge of accusation in his words. "You say we need to treat Jack as family, but what about everything I've worked for? My whole life, you've groomed me to step up here, to carry on our family's legacy. But now it feels like he's taking my place." Thomas's expression softened, a hint of sadness in his eyes. He leaned forward, addressing his son with calm authority. "Michael, no one is taking your place. I know how much you've given to this family and to this company. Your role here isn't changing. Jack's presence doesn't threaten that." Michael scoffed, shaking his head, disbelief etched on his face. "It may not feel that way to you, Dad, but it does to me. Since Jack arrived, everything's been about him. You haven't even asked how this has affected me, how I feel about him suddenly being a part of us." He shot Jack a look filled with a mix of frustration and anger, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though everyone could hear the hurt beneath his words. "I don't trust him. He doesn't belong here." Jack's fists clenched under the table, his own frustration building. He took a breath, steadying himself before speaking. "Michael, I didn't come here to replace anyone or take anything away from you," he said, his voice level but filled with emotion. "All I've ever wanted was a chance to help my sister, to give her a fighting chance. I didn't ask for any of this." Michael shook his head, looking away as if to avoid Jack's words. "I'm not buying it. It's convenient, isn't it? You get a foot in the door through some family connection, and suddenly, you're benefiting from everything my father's built." Thomas placed a hand on Michael's arm, his gaze firm but compassionate. "Enough, Michael," he said softly. "I understand your fears, but they aren't grounded in reality. You and Jack may have come from different paths, but you're both family, and I expect you to respect that." Sophia, who had been quiet until now, broke the silence, her voice warm and sincere as she turned to Jack. "For what it's worth, Jack, I'm glad you're here. Really." She gave him an encouraging smile. "Welcome to the family. I hope you'll find a place here that feels right for you." Jack looked at her, relief flickering in his eyes. Her support felt like a lifeline in the middle of the tension that hung in the room. "Thank you, Sophia," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "That means a lot." Thomas, visibly relieved by Sophia's words, nodded, his voice gentler as he looked around the table. "That's what I want for all of us," he said. "We're stronger together, not divided. We may have been separated for years, but that doesn't mean we can't move forward as one family." He leaned back, letting his words settle over the room, his gaze lingering on Michael, who still looked reluctant but subdued. Michael's simmering resentment continued to affect every interaction he had with Jack, casting a shadow over the family's attempts to move forward together. Each time Jack tried to connect or offered his help, Michael's response was either cold silence or worse, thinly veiled contempt. For Jack, this was draining. He was trying to honor his father's memory, to give Lily the support she needed, and yes, to find his own place here. But each time he made even the smallest step forward, Michael's hostility would set him back. Thomas, who had been aware of the tension but hoped it would ease with time, finally recognized that ignoring the issue was no longer an option. He saw how the strain was wearing on both Jack and Michael, and he feared that any further silence would permanently damage the possibility of a real relationship between them. So one evening, Thomas made a decision. He would confront his son about the truth behind his resentment. He found Michael alone in the study, seated at his desk, though his focus seemed distant, his eyes fixed on some unseen point across the room. Thomas closed the door softly and walked over, sitting across from him. For a moment, he simply watched his son, seeing the strain in his shoulders, the frustration masked by an indifferent expression. "Michael," Thomas began, his voice calm but direct, "we need to talk about this situation with Jack." Michael's posture stiffened, his eyes flicking to his father with a guarded expression. "If this is about my attitude," he said, his tone clipped, "I don't think there's anything left to say. You've made it clear how you feel." Thomas didn't look away, his gaze steady. "I have made it clear, Michael. But I don't think you've been honest with me, or with yourself, about how you feel." Michael's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing defensively. "What's there to be honest about? Jack showed up out of nowhere, and suddenly, he's supposed to be a part of everything? I've spent my whole life proving myself to you, to this family, and now I'm supposed to act like he deserves the same." Thomas leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Michael, your place in this family was never in question. You've worked hard, and you've earned my respect and trust. But Jack being here doesn't take that away from you. There's room for both of you." Michael let out a frustrated breath, shaking his head. "It's not that simple, Dad. Ever since Jack showed up, it's like everything I've done, everything I've built, doesn't matter as much. I'm supposed to just step aside, let him in like he's entitled to be here." Thomas reached out, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder, his expression filled with understanding. "Son, listen to me. Jack is family, yes. But you're my son. No one can replace you. No one can take away what you've achieved, or the bond we share. I've been proud of you from the moment you joined me here, from the way you've taken on responsibilities and helped this family grow." Michael looked away, his voice quieter, tinged with vulnerability. "I just don't want to lose you, Dad. I don't want you to forget me." Thomas's heart ached as he took in his son's words, finally understanding the depth of Michael's fears. He softened his tone, speaking with quiet reassurance. "Michael, you don't have to worry about that. You're my son. That's something that will never change, no matter who comes into our lives. You will always have a place here, a place no one else can take." Michael's shoulders slumped slightly, the tension visibly draining from his posture. For a long moment, he sat in silence, processing his father's words, the quiet promise in them. Finally, he met Thomas's gaze, his expression shifting, softened by an emotion that had been buried under his frustration and resentment. I guess I've been so focused on protecting what I thought was mine that I didn't realize I was pushing you away," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been acting selfishly. I didn't want Jack here because I was scared. I thought I'd lose something." Thomas gave his son's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Son, you haven't lost anything. This family is big enough for both you and Jack. All I ask is that you give him a chance, that you let him find his place here too." Michael nodded, taking a shaky breath. "I'll try, Dad. I don't know if I can just fix everything overnight, but I'll try." Thomas's face softened with pride, and he pulled his son into a quick, reassuring embrace. "That's all I ask, Michael. Just try. Give yourself the chance to know him." Strich. The next day, Michael found Jack in the office, seated at his desk, sifting through documents with a focused expression. For a moment, Michael hesitated, wondering if he'd find the right words. He hadn't realized until now how much his resentment had kept him isolated, had kept both him and Jack from finding common ground. Taking a breath, he approached, stopping just at the edge of Jack's desk. Jack looked up, surprised to see Michael standing there, and set down the papers he was holding. He could tell immediately that Michael's expression was different this time. There was no guarded hostility, only a tentative openness that caught Jack off guard. "Jack," Michael began, clearing his throat as he spoke, "I wanted to say something. To apologize, actually." Jack blinked, his brow furrowing slightly in confusion. "Apologize?" He sat back, studying Michael's face, trying to understand. Michael nodded, his voice quiet but sincere. "I know I've been difficult. More than difficult, probably. I haven't treated you fairly. I acted like you were a threat, like you were here to take something from me, and that was wrong." He glanced away, his expression conflicted, before looking back at Jack with a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "I've been selfish. I didn't see you as family. I just saw you as someone getting in my way." Jack listened, his own expression softening. He could see that this admission wasn't easy for Michael. It took courage to let his guard down like this. "Michael," Jack began carefully, his voice calm, I never came here to take anything from you. I know how important this family is to you. All I wanted was to give Lily a better life, and maybe find my own place here." Michael nodded, swallowing, his voice almost a whisper. "I know that now. I was just scared. Scared that you'd replace me, that Dad would see you as the son he never had." Jack shook his head, his gaze steady. "I don't want to replace you, Michael. I have no interest in competing with you. You belong here in a way I'm still figuring out for myself." Michael's face softened, a faint but genuine smile breaking through. "I get that now. And I'm sorry for making things harder than they needed to be. I hope maybe we can start over." Jack smiled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. He extended his hand to Michael, who took it without hesitation, the handshake firm but filled with a new sense of understanding. "I'd like that," Jack said. "It's a fresh start for both of us." For the first time, Jack felt a genuine connection between them, the beginnings of something that felt real. As they released their handshake, Michael offered a small, tentative grin. There was still much to figure out, but for now there was peace, an agreement that both of them could exist within the family without stepping on each other's dreams. And as he watched Michael walk away, Jack felt that he'd finally been given the acceptance he'd been searching for. The months that followed were filled with a sense of purpose and unity that was new to all of them. With the family finally unified, Thomas was determined to create something that would reflect the journey they'd all taken, a journey of reconnection, healing, and finding hope where once there had only been separation and struggle. He called Jack, Michael, Sophia, and the rest of the family together for an evening meeting in his study. "I've been thinking," Thomas began, leaning forward, his eyes resting on each of them in turn, "about what this family means now, and how we can do more than just rebuild within these walls. We're in a position to give back, to help others the way we helped each other." He paused, glancing at Jack, a smile playing on his lips. "Jack, I want you to lead this initiative. I'd like to establish the Peterson Bennett Foundation, dedicated to helping families in need. And I believe that you are the person to give this foundation heart, direction, and purpose." Jack looked at him in shock, barely processing the words at first. "You want me to lead a foundation? In Dad's name?" Jack's voice was filled with a mixture of surprise and awe. The thought of honoring his father's memory in such a way had never even crossed his mind, but he felt an immediate sense of responsibility and purpose. Thomas nodded, his voice soft but resolute. "You've shown all of us, Jack, what it truly means to fight for family. This foundation would be our way of continuing that legacy, helping others find hope and support during times of crisis. It's a calling, and I believe you're exactly the right person for it." Across the room, Karen looked at her son, her eyes filling with tears of pride. "Jack, it's like you were meant for this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This is exactly what your father would have wanted, to help others who are struggling, just like he once did for us." Michael, too, offered Jack a nod of respect. "You've already shown us how much this means to you, Jack. I think we all know you'll make it something special, and I'd be honored to work alongside you." Jack took a steadying breath, looking around the room at the faces of the family who had become so much more to him than he could have ever anticipated. Thomas, who had opened a door when all hope seemed lost, Michael, who had transformed from a rival into a brother, and Sophia, who had given him unwavering support. And there was Emily, his friend and confidant, who'd been there from the very beginning, grounding him through every high and low. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all. I promise, I'll do everything I can to make the Peterson Bennett Foundation a place of real change, where we can help families in the same way that you helped mine." Strich. The days that followed were filled with a flurry of planning, brainstorming, and collaboration. Jack, with Emily at his side, took charge, immersing himself in every detail, from the mission statement to the budget allocations and the selection of team members who would bring the foundation to life. Sophia joined him, her natural kindness and warmth lending a touch of compassion to every decision they made, while Michael provided invaluable insights on the financial side, helping ensure the foundation would be sustainable long-term. Emily's background in community work and her knack for organization made her the perfect ally as they tackled one decision after another. She encouraged Jack to infuse every aspect of the foundation with the values he held closest: compassion, resilience, and family. Together, they envisioned programs that could provide emergency financial support, counseling, and job training for struggling parents and scholarships for children who showed promise but lacked resources. It was more than just a charitable endeavor, it was a mission to rebuild lives. Finally, after months of hard work, the launch event arrived. They had transformed a grand hall into a gathering space filled with friends, family, and prominent members of the community. As people arrived, Jack felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. He glanced over at Emily, who gave him an encouraging nod, and then at Thomas, whose proud smile reminded Jack of how far they'd all come. Even Michael, once so resistant to his presence, stood by him with a steady hand on his shoulder, a symbol of the support and acceptance he had longed for. Taking a breath, Jack stepped up to the podium. He scanned the crowd, spotting familiar faces: Karen, watching him with a proud and tearful gaze; Emily, who'd been his steadfast partner in this endeavor; Sophia, smiling in encouragement; and Thomas, whose unwavering belief in him had made all of this possible. Finally, he looked at Michael, whose nod gave him the courage to begin. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Jack started, his voice filled with emotion. The Peterson Bennett Foundation is more than just a name. It's a testament to what family can accomplish when we come together, even through the most difficult times. When I first found my way to this family, it was during one of the darkest periods of my life. I felt alone, desperate, and uncertain about the future. But in finding all of you, I found something far more powerful than I could have imagined: a place to belong, a family who gave me hope when I had none." He paused, letting the words sink in, then continued, his tone resolute. "This foundation is our way of giving that hope back to others. We want to help families who are struggling, to show them that they don't have to face their challenges alone. Whether it's a family fighting to make ends meet, a parent hoping to give their child a better life, or a young person searching for their path, we want to be there for them. Because no one should have to go through life feeling like they have nowhere to turn." The crowd erupted into applause, and Jack felt the overwhelming support of everyone around him. It was a moment he knew he would carry with him forever, a moment that symbolized not only his journey but the incredible transformation of the family he had become a part of. Strich. In the months that followed, the foundation grew rapidly, becoming a symbol of hope and support for families across the community. Jack worked tirelessly, personally meeting with families, listening to their stories, and finding ways the foundation could make a real difference. Michael, true to his word, became one of Jack's closest allies, offering strategic guidance and helping secure partnerships that expanded the foundation's reach. Through their work, they began to trust and respect one another, and their bond deepened, the old tensions giving way to a genuine brotherhood. Sophia and Emily, too, became an inseparable team, coordinating outreach programs and providing personal support to the families they served. Sophia's gentle spirit and Emily's practical expertise created a balance that made every family feel understood and valued. Together, they launched workshops, counseling sessions, and scholarship programs, each designed to uplift and empower families facing adversity. During one family dinner a few months later, the family gathered around the table, the warmth and ease between them unmistakable. They laughed, shared stories of the foundation's progress, and reflected on how much their lives had changed. Karen, watching her son with pride, finally spoke up. She reached across the table, placing a gentle hand on Jack's arm. "Jack," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "your father would be so proud of you. What you've done with this foundation, the way you've honored his memory, he would be so incredibly proud." Jack looked at her, his own eyes shining with emotion. He covered her hand with his, nodding. "I feel him with us, Mom," he replied quietly. "And I know that somehow he guided me here." Thomas raised his glass, his face filled with pride and gratitude as he looked around at the family he had once thought he might never see whole. "To family," he said, his voice filled with a depth of meaning that everyone felt. "To family," they echoed, each voice filled with a unique sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them together. In that moment, Jack knew that this was more than just a legacy. It was a new beginning, born out of pain, resilience, and the rediscovery of hope. He had come to this family in desperation, but what he found was more than he had ever dreamed possible, a family bound not just by blood, but by purpose and love. And through the Peterson Bennett Foundation, he knew they would continue that legacy, bringing hope to countless families, one step at a time.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.